Jeffrey characterizes Thelwell's poetic ambition as, quote, impatience of honest industry and presumptuous vanity, concluding that Thelwell should remain behind the shop counter. That was the quotation. The examples of Keats and Thelwell give credibility to Gareth Stedman Jones's provocative argument that class is an entirely discursive formation. Dominating discussion of class is the three-class paradigm, aristocracy, middle class, working class, that historians consider not wholly applicable for English society between 1750 and 1850, but not wholly irrelevant either. Marxist historian R.S. Neal has developed a useful five-class model applicable to the late 18th and early decades of the 19th century, the formative phase of industrial capitalism. The exclusive authoritarian landowning upper class, that would be one, the deferential middle class, the upper middle class would be another, the socially blocked, less deferential, and often politically insurgent middling classes, that would be the third, then the working class seeking state protection, such as the whites, the weavers, and finally the deferential, dependent, and politically passive working class, the servants. The servant class was the largest class at the time. With Neal's model in mind, one can take another look at the three major laboring class poets of the Romantic era. Tenant farmer Burns, who also received much more than a minimal education, he had quite a good education, is perhaps as much middling as laboring class, while Bloomfield's urban experiences as a shoemaker placed him in contact with London radicalism, dominated by the middling class. As a poor agricultural laborer, John Clare would fall into Neal's working class, much more materially dependent on landowners than Bloomfield. According to Neal, after mid-century, industrialization had diminished the role of the middling class, as working class and bourgeois radicalism were ascendant. But in the period from 1800 to the 1840s, the middling class was, quote, the central, most unstable, and most significant political class in England. And that I think, is a brilliant insight, because that means, Keats, Blake, Thelwell, they're all in them, Cobbett, they're all in that group. And they dominate the Chartist leaders come from that group, as does the London Corresponding Society. The cultural insurgence of the middling class is evident in the case not just of Burns, but I don't want to repeat myself. Favorite occupations for worker intellectuals and poets were shoemaking, tailoring, and printing, as these trades required relatively less concentrated attention than other skilled trades and permitted relatively more leisure for reading and writing. And that was the insight by Jacques Rancière, really interesting French historian. As printing technology was less capital intensive than it would become after the steam press, the early 19th century was a golden age of independent printers. So from circa 1800 to 1850, you see this flowering of small presses, small editions, workers publishing their work. After 1850, it declines quite a bit. It's also notable that agricultural labor rather than factory work dominates Romantic era laboring class poetry, mostly because few adult men worked in the factories until the 1830s. Poet laureate and former 1790s radical Robert Southey wrote the first critical treatment of laboring class poets in his long introduction to the poetry of John Jones in Old Servant. Far from seeing plebeian poetry a threat to the established order, Southey claims that what he calls bad poetry cannot cause any harm, and sometimes the work of the uneducated poets, as he calls them, is considerably better than bad. Thomas Carlyle, in his review essay, Corn Law Rhymes, 1832, challenges Southey's dismissive concept of the uneducated poet by attacking Southey's concept of normative education as exclusively aristocratic and socially privileged. Carlyle finds the reformist poetry of Ebenezer Eliot energetically powerful. For a generation that reads Cobbett's prose, the quote, and from Carlyle, and Burns's poetry, it need be no miracle that there is a man like Eliot who can handle both pen and hammer like a man. Carlyle's Burns pairs the Scottish ploughman with the noble Byron as the two most important poets of the age. Carlyle is not treating Burns as a, quote, freak of nature, but as a representative figure of the new anti-aristocratic age in which the most creative energies are coming from plebeian writers. Burns became the model for the peasant poet for 19th century laboring class poets like Bloomfield and Clare, just as Stephen Duck had been the model in the 18th century. Carlyle's sense of the historical transition from aristocratic domination is also articulated by the historian Michael Davis, who points out that although the London Corresponding Society that flourished in the 1790s did not achieve its political goals, which were universal manhood suffrage, it exerted considerable cultural influence in terms of overall literacy and education. Even before the French Revolution, plebeian cultural creativity accompanied other politically insurgent moments, such as the Wilkes and Liberty movement in the 1760s, sympathy with the American Revolution in the 1770s, slavery abolition and parliamentary reform in the 1780s and 90s. As William Christmas argues, plebeian poets were capable of articulating ideological resistance against the dominant culture within poetic discourses that were both publishable and marketable in the period. While there was an inexorable movement against aristocratic domination in all fields, there was also the residual power of patronage, an aristocratic relationship that the upper middle class elite exercised extensively in the 18th century. One of the first laboring class poets, Stephen Duck, famously received the patronage of Queen Caroline after his well-received The Thresher's Labor in 1730. After Duck's suicide, he became a negative example of the dangers of patronage and excessive ambition. The patronage relationship was not uniformly demeaning, but entailed a variety of configurations. One of the most talented laboring class poets, Mary Lepore, her years are 1722 to 46, enjoyed what appears to have been a friendly relationship and very rewarding with her patron, Bridget Fremantle. But the most discussed and contentious patronage relationship was that between Hannah More, a poet in her own right, and Anne Yearsley, the milkwoman, as she was referred to. Like Yearsley, Robert Bloomfield came from the countryside, and also like Yearsley, he did not stay there, for he spent much of his life after the age of 11 in London as a shoemaker, exposed to the cosmopolitan currents of urban life available to an artisan. With access to newspapers, listening at the old Jewry Chapel to the radical sermons of Joseph Fawcett, attending with his brother the debates at the Coachmakers' Hall, studying the older English poets in cheap editions. That's, well, yeah, I think I'll get to that. Bloomfield was uniquely positioned to integrate various strands of plebeian culture. Bloomfield's astonishingly popular The Farmer's Boy, published in 1800, sold over 26,000 copies in 3 years. Undercuts complacent images of pastoral harmony in a number of ways. The poetry does not repress the physical difficulties of labor, and here's a quote, oft doomed in suffocating heat to bear the cobweb farms in pure and dusty air. And it represents vividly the suffering of farm animals, including horses, tormented by flies, and perhaps most importantly, it registers a strong protest against the new practices of farming which violate the ancient ties between the rich and the poor. Bloomfield records the transition to a new market-based norm from the older norm of class reciprocity, what E.P. Thompson called the moral economy. The most dramatic defense of the moral economy during the Romantic era came during the Luddite insurgency, which was 1811 to 1813, described eloquently in E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. Kevin Binfield has recovered the textual history of the most powerful laboring class rebellion in the Romantic era. In fact, during the Luddite uprising, there were more soldiers trying to put down the Luddite uprising than were in Europe fighting against Napoleon. That's how serious it was. His study and anthology of Luddite text from the Midlands, Yorkshire, and Northwest richly supplements the famous interpretation of the Luddites in Thompson's study. The leaders of the weavers, framework knitters, and stockingers had petitioned Parliament for regulation of their industry, only to see the Elizabethan laws struck down in the name of the free market.